problem with thought experiments like that is that they're actually not possible. Like, so
That's why it's called a thought experiment. Of course it's not possible. This is the big problem with Schrodinger's cat. A cat can't simultaneously be alive and dead. Observations don't truly interact with reality. Yeah, congratulations.
How morality is constructed based on trolley problems, and people are like, well, that's not really how morality is constructed. It's not all based.
Here's the interesting, let's find a real world application for this theory, okay? So if you're not aware, the experienced machine, I've never seen Shapiro fight harder for talking time than when he does with Peterson. Well, I think it's because Peterson's really bad at going back and forth in a conversation with somebody. This is the hallmark of a bad conversation. A good conversation is, I start a conversational thread, and then somebody else will. New Peterson Shapiro talk posted 13 days ago.
You know, the issue that you started to become really politically prominent on, which is the Bill C-16 in Ontario and
Canada, it was federal law.
In Canada, the gender issue.
Yeah.
You know, that's the issue where now the question that's constantly being asked, so why do you even care? Why do you even pay attention? And the answer is because—
I was asked that earlier today.
Oh, really? What did you say?
I'm not letting the cat have my tongue.
Yeah.
It's like it has nothing to do with gender as far as I'm concerned, or that's peripheral in some sense. So the accusation, why do you care? Fair enough. It's like, you know, in some way, people can go to hell in a handbasket if they're inclined to. Mm-hmm. Now, I would rather have that not happen, but people are...
Wait, hold on one sec. Stay tuned.
What would you say? Doomed to their own autonomy. But I'm not saying words that other people want me to say. And the idea of compelled speech, it's like, the bill was this much about gender.
Right.
And it was this much about,
right.
Oh yeah, the government's going to tell me what to say, hey. But now they're regulating what therapists can say, therapy sessions.
This is interesting, because to me, the problem with a lot of this is less a free speech issue, even though...
Hold on, I have to...
You know, you could probably add a check to your positions page that shows something different if the referrer says the viewer came from Vice.
Like receiving traffic from any, no, because that would assume they're coming from like a similar domain from work or whatever. They could be like serving their website at home. That would be really funny though. If you mark like all traffic from like CNN or Slate or Vice or whatever, it's like, hey, I've noticed that you're a journalist trying to be a disingenuous piece of shit. Yeah. What happened to the positions page? It got cited 2 times, and every time it got cited, people would take one click. I was like, okay, I'll make a website. It has all my positions. Somebody suggested the project, and they put a lot of work into like writing positions off. And I was like, cool. And then I started updating and changing everything. And then I got cited once in a Vice article, and then once somewhere else. And I think somebody in that, I remember the Vice article really well. Somebody wrote in the Vice article, like, oh, well, here's Destiny. He's got a page where he writes about his opinion on pedophilia. This is what he wrote about me, and has weathered a number of controversies around his political views in defense of his use of racial slurs. His personal website contains a section that outlines his thoughts on political and philosophical issues, from the use of political violence to thought experiments about incest and child porn.
On the same page with you. Mm-hmm. And to me,
it's crazy to me that a bakery or cafe or whatever would let these guys, who are relatively controversial, record here.
It really is a fundamental truth issue, meaning that, yeah, you're trying to force me to say something I don't want to say, but to me, the fact of what you're trying...
I don't like the compelled speech argument. I think it's a really weak argument. When you say like they're trying to compel speech, like what is, like, I don't think I agree with that. Nobody's like compelling you to speak in a certain way. They're just telling you not to say a certain thing, but I don't know if that's like the same thing. Like, so for instance, let's say historically, I just refer to black people as the N-word, okay? I mean, I'm Destiny, I do all the time, every time in my real life, all the time, unironically with a hard R, right? Let's say that I do that, okay? And then the government's like, hey, we're gonna make a new law. If you have employees, you're not allowed to call them the N-word anymore. You have to treat them like human beings. And I'm like, seriously? Compelled speech? Like, calling that compelled speech just doesn't feel... I feel like it's the weakest argument. Like, there might be other arguments that he can make, like some ontological. There might be some ontological arguments that he can make. So, like, things relating to, like, when we say what a male is or what a female is, and then trying to confuse these things, like blah blah blah. Like, maybe there's some arguments. If you really want to, sure, I would disagree with them, but they're better arguments than this compelled speech thing. Destiny, you are conflating you can't say this with you should say this. But like, it's not, I just don't think it's compelled speech. So for instance, is it compelled speech that you have to call somebody by their name when you go to work a job? Because I'm pretty sure employers probably have to use your name, right? Or is it compelled speech to say that you should refer to somebody as like Mr. or Mrs.? Like, it's a garbage argument. It's just a dog shit argument. There are better arguments out there if you want to challenge it on these grounds.
I just think our brains are not built for this. I think...
Wait, hold on.
trying to force me to say is so innately opposed to the good is the problem. Like you could try. I would have objections to you forcing me to say that I like a particular movie, right? It may not be true. I don't like a particular movie. It would be bad if you tried to force me to say that. But the level of passion that I have for issues.
Oh my God, infrared beefing with Bad Bunny? Hold on. This is some like, how can I resist watching? Remember this, Bad Bunny? Remember your Discord likes might cover it on stream. Oh my God, ha 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 ha.
How did my whole speech about how I need subs to get the stream going, if you like the content, blah, 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 how that results in 0 subs?
Dude, Bad Bunny, it fucked it up so hard.
Issues like this one really go to the fact that I think the fundamental good of humanity relies on basic acknowledgments of biological truth, especially when it comes to gender. And anybody who's ever dealt with children, I find myself getting, if I look at my own political evolution, I'd say that when I grew up in a religious home, so that means that.
I wish that these guys would have, well, Peterson has sometimes, Ben Shapiro won't. I wish these guys would be more open to having conversations with people that could actually critically challenge their views. Not like in a, I want to shit on you kind of way, but then like, let's talk a little bit more about this. Because I do agree that people on the left are too quick to throw out every norm and every convention without even thinking about why they exist, which is stupid. People on the left do this. It's really dumb. But people on the right take a lot for granted as well, right? Like, well, gender norms and biological truths are really important, especially when it comes to children. Yeah, sure, kind of. But it can also be really fucking harmful when it comes to children. Like, can we acknowledge that too? It's really fucking shitty that a lot of girls growing up are told that, like, you're not allowed to play video games. Now, it's not as big a deal now as it was, like, back when I was a kid, but, like, some of these enforced gender norms are really garbage. Now, some of them can be fine. Some of them are okay, depending on how you live. And if you want to do things, you can do things. And if you want to support things for your children, you can support those things. But a lot of the gender norms are pretty harmful stereotypically as well. I think it's good to acknowledge both sides of that. But Destiny, isn't the problem that 99% of leftists just want to debate them and just shut at them? Yeah, the problem is most of them just can't navigate the conversations well because they're challenging conversations. Destiny, it can never be harmful to children. It absolutely, rigidly enforcing a gender dichotomy on a child where it's like, these are the male things you can do and these are the female things you can absolutely be harmful to a child. Absolutely.
A leftier than thou type Andy. No, this person is straight up a fucking...
What is this?
Liberal with a hate boner.
Wikipedia page?
Probably from a specific community.
The Daliban is attacking Wikipedia now? What?
Who thinks that I'm like not irrelevant, but he wishes for me to be. You know, I would go ahead and assume that this person has probably made a bunch of similar takes or a bunch of similar requests to delete other leftists too.
Okay, I don't care.
Pretty conservative. And then you go to college and you're living by yourself and you're not married, you don't have kids. You tend to become a little bit more libertarian, which is like, okay, you know, let everybody do whatever they're going to do and it's not going to bother me. And then you have kids and you realize that there's a pool in which we are all swimming. And that pool is going to define...
Virginia.
Exactly. Like my kid, it's going to determine how my kid lives. And I want my community to reflect some of my values because I don't want my kid to live in the toxic sludge that you are creating for my kid. I don't want you indoctrinating my kids in bullshit about whether
yes, exactly.
a boy can be a girl, or a girl can be a
people will
girl.
say, well, I'll exceed, but not for my children.
Yeah.
And that's what Virginia demonstrated. It's like, you can come after me, but you come after my kids, and that's a whole different story.
It's so fundamentally opposed to everything true, and the fact that and that's the insistence. I
also hate that Ben Shapiro, I don't know if he just has an unwillingness to engage with philosophy or what, but he uses these words so often, objectively. Like, bro, shut the fuck up. You're talking about social norms right now, okay? You're as far from any kind of you could not be farther from an objective conversation than a discussion over what our social norms ought to be, okay? Like, if there was ever a realm of subjectivity, like, this is going to be it. Jesus Christ. He's way too confident when he speaks about something like, objectively speaking, we absolutely need to enforce these gender realities that have changed like pretty significantly throughout all of human history, depending on what we're talking about. In some ways they have, some ways they haven't. Like, just fuck, I hate it when he drops that word so much. People, I'm not trying to whatever, but sometimes it feels like people want to drop these words objectively when they just want to come across as having more authority on a subject than they really earned the right to have.
insistence isn't that people be treated humanely or be treated decently. The insistence is that your vision of yourself be reflected by me in defiance of baseline reality and in order to redefine how society as a whole
Well,
works.
a lot of it's murky thinking. You know, if someone asked me, do I believe that there are gender fluid people? I would say yes. And I would say a young man who's gender fluid, I know what he's like temperamentally. He's high in agreeableness. He's high in neuroticism. So he has a feminine temperament. He's more interested in people than things. And he's extremely high in openness. And so his temperament is fluid. He's creative, and so he's one thing one day and one thing the next. And his fundamental temperament is tilted towards the feminine. But that doesn't mean he's not a man.
Right, exactly.
So so it's murky thinking. So
that's exactly right.
It's certainly the case that 1 out of 10 women, now it depends on where you put the cutoff, say, but you could say with reasonable certainty that 1 in 10 women has a masculine temperament and 1 in 10 men has a feminine temperament. And so that's a lot of people. And those people, especially if they're also creative, well, they're kind of at a loss in relationship to what to do with their identity, because they're pulled. First of all, they have a hard time catalyzing their identity. Creative people have a hard time catalyzing it. It's like the definition of creativity. They're protean. And so there have been people who play at the edges of gender identity forever. And fair enough. And sometimes that's even admirable if it's done in a sophisticated way. And it's charismatic. So you see it in Mick Jagger, you see it in David Bowie, you see it in people like Madonna as well, because Madonna had a hard edge, that was very masculine. And all the Marvel superhero women have a hard masculine edge. And so we find that charismatic because those people are also integrated. But the notion that there's such a thing as gender, that's not right. There's variability in personality and temperament. And the idea that there's no such thing as biological sex, that's just insane.
It's insanity. They've abstracted gender from sex and then read gender back into sex as more important than sex. It's
well, and then why insist upon the biological modifications?
Right.
If there's no such thing as sex, it's like, well, then just act out your role.
Right.
Leave your body alone because it's irrelevant anyways. Well, it turns out it's not irrelevant. You have to go through the surgical transformation, which is a pretty dramatic answer to a question that for 99% of people who are ambivalent about their gender identity would be best solved without surgical intervention.
This is kind of true, but only in responding to the most radical of thought on the left. It's so annoying because this is why I fight with these dipshits like DemonMama so much, because the dog shit arguments that they put out are indefensible, right? If you're going to tell me that like sex isn't real or that like these things are entirely arbitrarily constructed, then Jordan Peterson's next answer here actually is next question is totally reasonable. Why the fuck did you have a surgery in the real place? Just live however you want to live then. Act out your role, right? If you think anybody can be like an attack helicopter, gender, or autism, okay, then why do you need a surgery to match any body shit? If you don't think any of this is real anyway and it's all arbitrary, This is my huge problem with idiots like DemonMama or anybody else pretending to be able to have these conversations. It's super frustrating because the point that Peterson brings up here is a true and valid point.
Yeah.
And then so now in Canada, because they banned conversion therapy, it's now all affirmation therapy.
Right.
There's no such thing as affirmation therapy.
Right. No, it's insane. I mean, the semantic game that was used in order to say, well, conversion therapy.
Your objectivity rant just now is whenever you talk about the gym, food, movies, television, and music. No, it's not. You're just a Care Bear dipshit, baby. I phrase all of my stuff so carefully, and it doesn't even matter. I'll say over and over again, like, oh, this is just my opinion. Like, I don't necessarily think about it. I found this to be that. But even if I say that over and over again, like, you guys will still come out like, why does Destiny think that Dune was an objectively fucking horrible movie? No, I'm just giving you my opinions, okay? Dude, Haas is fucking Twitter right now.
Part of the reason
Holy shit, sorry.
Which was at one time using electric shock to treat homosexuals.
Yeah.
And saying that that's the same thing as you have a gender-confused 12-year-old.
Look, I had a 14-year-old kid who was a client of mine, and he was in the mid stages of puberty. He was a pretty creative kid. Agreeable kid as well, right? And that's important. So he had a bit of a feminine temperament. And that also meant he could be pushed around fairly easily. Well, there was an aggressively gay guy in his school who was hitting on him and trying to convince him that he was gay. Well, he didn't know So he wanted to talk to me about it. It's like, well, I wasn't going to tell him. What the hell do I know about this kid?
Exactly.
You know, and I wanted to hear what his problems were and how it might be sorted out, what he wanted. And like that's what you do in therapy, is you help people sort out their problems. Now this idea is you come to me with an axiomatic claim, whatever it is about your identity, and my job is to rubber stamp it. It's like, I'm not a therapist then. So this is not only insane, this insistence. Like, I like to think of truth, untruth, and anti-truth, right? And the notion that therapists affirm is an anti-truth. Because, look, let's say you come to me and you say, you have a proposition about yourself, and I say, no, I'm your therapist. No, that's wrong. It's like, that's not good therapy. But neither is you have a proposition about yourself, and you're disturbed enough to come to a therapeutic session, and I say, yes, you're right. It's like, I don't know if you're right. And if you're so right, why are you here? Like, what are we talking about if you're already right?
It's a destruction of basically the only form of therapy that we know to work.
Yes,
cognitive behavioral therapy. It's all about saying that
so are the rest of them. They're all this is one of the things that's interesting about clinical psychology. Every single school of psychotherapy is predicated on the idea that free expression of thought or the free transmutation of behavior is curative. And it's true with cognitive behavioral therapy, just like psychoanalytic therapy. It's all the same thing. And also the other axiom of therapy is voluntarily expose yourself in measured doses to what you're afraid of. And so that's an interesting thing, because the psychoanalysts believed when the behaviorists first came up with exposure therapy, they had it formulated wrong. They thought you learn to be afraid. So you're normal, and then something hurts you, and then you learn to be afraid of it. That's wrong. You're always afraid, except when you learn not to. So they had it exactly backwards neuropharmacologically, and it really matters. This matters. That doesn't mean you can't learn some fears. You can, but mostly you unlearn terror, right? So children are afraid to get away from their mother. It's because they're afraid of the entire world. Well, you have to learn how not to be. And you don't learn that by habituation, because that was the idea. So you take someone who's afraid, they've been conditioned to be afraid, you expose them to what they're afraid of, and then you have them do relaxation exercises so they counter condition. Well, then it was discovered, and they don't have to do the relaxation exercises. It's like, oh, well, it still works, just exposure. It's like, well, they get less afraid when you expose them, because their fear habituates. So then the psychoanalyst said, well, if they get less afraid of that particular thing, the symptoms are just going to substitute, because that fear of an elevator, say, was reflective of a deeper fear of death. Had a client I exposed to an elevator, the doors open, she said, that's a tube. It's like, and her fantasy about the elevator was, it was a place she was going to die in of a heart attack. Well, people were discomforted and, what would you say, made contemptuous of her foolishness while she was suffering and dying. So social alienation and death, that was the elevator for her. So we expose her to the elevator. What does she learn? Not to be afraid of the elevator. No. She learns she can tolerate those fears. She learns to be brave. And so the psychoanalysts were they were diametrically wrong, because if you expose someone to anything they're afraid of, effectively they get less afraid of everything, right? And so that's partly why psychotherapy is curative in that manner, is that people discover that they're bigger than their fears. They don't discover that the fears are trivial.
I think that the cult of authenticity is going to be the destruction of all psychotherapy then. Because if the cult of authenticity is that your true authentic feelings are what makes you you, then the attempt to make you brave in spite of your fears is a suppression of your fears. It's almost like a Freudian analysis of you're suppressing your sexual desire, and this is not full authenticity.
Yeah, right. Why isn't the
This is fuck. I feel like as time goes on, these statements are going to become a little bit more true. It's not healthy to validate every single feeling that a person has. Or rather, you can validate feelings, but at some point we need to understand that some feelings can change. One big issue is I've talked about this a lot, framing everything through the lens of trauma and using trauma to describe everything, I think has been incredibly negative when it comes to conversations about anything, mental health, work, anything, that like everything is traumatizing, that everything leaves a lasting mark, that like people about like the slur discourse, like, oh, the N-word, that's traumatizing. When a lot of people go, they have a PTSD, so it's like, really? Like maybe if they've actually like had like a traumatic experience with it, but like by default, no, come on, let's be real here. I think a lot of this happens on Twitter too, with like the romanticization of mental illness, with people constantly reinforcing like, oh yeah, self-diagnosis is totally cool and valid and awesome, and all of this crazy shit. I think you have to be really, really, really careful with this stuff. No, you're not. You have to be careful. It's bad. At some point, you should be able to say like, hey, we need to be able to talk about this, and you need to be able to put your big boy pants on or big girl pants on, and say like, hey, you might have a feeling, and not all of your feelings are necessarily reflected in the real world. Like, not every single time a woman is treated poorly, every single time a black person is treated poorly, it doesn't always mean somebody was racist. You might have been an asshole. You might have fucked up. You might have legitimately not gotten that job because you suck. It's possible. And this externalization of all of our problems, or all of the responsibility for our problems, that nothing can be our fault, that everything is the world around us, that capitalism is to blame, that everything else is to blame, blah, 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 is, I think is incredibly detrimental to like a person's development. I don't think it's good. That's kind of where we're at right now.
Fear you.
Right, exactly.
The authentic you.
Exactly, and I think that's kind of where we're going. It seems like
so this movement towards unity that we were talking about, this is a place I think where like informed liberals and conservatives could meet. It's like, well, there is this authenticity, let's say, and drive for adventure, and you see that elevated to the highest place in some sense in the more careless Disney movies. But the full manifestation of that in an integrated sense is the drive towards authenticity inside this higher order unity. It has to be, because otherwise it's disuniting. It causes fragmentation and chaos. And so it has to be subordinate to a higher order end. And then you might say, well, what is that? Part of that's the reciprocal altruism that the evolutionary biologists are always on about. It's like, some for you, some for me.
Seems like X is valid played into this a lot. People took that and made it that X is correct, which goes pretty far beyond what valid was supposed to mean. Yeah, true. It's kind of like how some people we have firsthand experiences with will weaponize certain psych terms because they don't understand what they actually mean. And I'll explain this again since it needs to be said because apparently nobody understands this. A feeling being valid does not mean that the feeling is reflective of reality. It doesn't mean that the feeling is good, and it doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to change the feeling. Saying that a feeling is valid just means that if you feel a certain way, it's okay to accept that you have that feeling, but maybe it's a feeling that you should change. People completely misunderstand this concept. Valid does not mean that it should be never changed and that it's a good thing. But yeah, ugh. Something Andrew Huberman, Stanford Neuroscience, has said is that things that you pay mind to are the things that change around you. As in, just because something happens to and around you, it only makes it change to you if you give it actual mindfulness. Maybe?
For you, some for me, in measure, right? And that makes both of us richer. And so that's part of the...
It's so hard to get my girlfriend to understand that she's allowed to feel some way, and they didn't choose to feel that way, but the tantrum following it is suddenly allowed and okay. True.
Higher order unity, and people are intensely reciprocally altruistic.
That's great.
It's good.
Actually, if I can get a re-up on something, that would be awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. And so...
what did he say? You have 2 more minutes? What, for his food or until they have to leave? Are they kicking him out?
It's authenticity in the service of what? Now, when Pinocchio becomes real, he's already rescued his father, right? So he's established an accord with the tradition that gave birth to him already. He's revitalized that. So when he wakes up, he's not free. He doesn't have any strings on him anymore, but he's already existing in a harmonious relationship with his father. It's a big deal. And one of the lovely things about what happens to me as a consequence of my lectures is that lots of fathers and sons come up to me and say, we've really worked out our relationship. It's like, and they're both like, you've never seen smiles like that. It's really something.
Oh my God, stop being so fucking melodramatic.
To be stopped on the street and to be told that, to see people so joyful about that, because it's their heart desire, you know? And that's that integration of that drive to autonomy with the family, with the father, with the mother, with the broader community. all that has to be in a higher order unity.
Yeah, exactly. And I think
that's the conservative insistence, right?
Exactly. Is that there are the wall, as you said before, the walls have to exist. You can have autonomy, but the autonomy has to exist within the walls. And then once you let the autonomy or the rationalism destroy all the walls,
well, there's no
place for it to
autonomy
sit.
without the walls. There's just chaos.
I just think our brains are not built for this. I think the human beings have now outstripped what our brains were built for, and we're building systems that we don't know the consequences of, and more than that, we're then building, almost in the way that we're talking about with carbohydrates. It's like we built an entire dietary system to provide to a piece of junk food that our body craves because it used to be rare in the wilderness. And I feel
sugar's
like,
definitely that.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like that's exactly what's happening.
You used to have to fight bees for sugar. You paid a high price for it.
Right, exactly. And now I feel like that it's the same sort of thing with regard to social media and the metaverse and all this stuff. I think we're constructing worlds that are just designed for the sugar high and the dopamine release. And I'm afraid that we're going to live inside it. I was reading Robert Nozick the other day, and he has this thing in Man and I'm trying to remember the name of his book, State and Anarchy, and he has something that he posits, he calls the experience machine, and his basic theory is that if you are given the choice to live inside a machine where you get all of the feedback loops of pleasure and it feels real and all of this stuff, you still wouldn't choose to live in it because you would understand that you're not having any real world impact. But the problem is, what if everybody else is inside the experience machine with you? I think that the libertarian basis for society is kind of falling away, because if everything...
I think the problem with thought experiments like that is that they're actually not possible. Like,
shut up!
And I think
it's sorry. That's why it's called a thought experiment. Of course it's not possible.
That's actually a technical problem with conundrums like that.
This is the big problem with Schrodinger's cat. A cat can't simultaneously be alive and dead. Observations don't truly interact with reality. Yeah, congratulations, okay?
There's a conundrum. Claire Lehman talked to me about this, the editor of Quillette. She was asked this question. It's one of these philosophical conundrums, and so this is a rough one. So imagine that you're in Amsterdam during World War II, and the Nazis are everywhere, and you have a Jewish family in the attic, and you're up there with a baby, and there's 25 Nazi...
Oh, is this our deontological challenge or whatever?
Nazi officers on the ground floor, and the baby starts to cry. Do you smother the baby?
Oh, never
You
mind.
save all the people upstairs. And Claire, who was a mother of a very young child at that time, said her response was, "Don't ask me such stupid questions," which I think is actually the right response. And it's more embodied response, right? And you can trap your philosophical cognition into weird corners, but that doesn't mean that your fundamental intuitions are flawed.
Yeah, this is right.
With this Nozick thing, it's like, well, if you could not have a body, it's like, yeah, no. You know, you're grounded out in the world.
That's the rejection of Derek Parfit, right? So Derek Parfit's entire moral theory is the trolley problems, and you can decide how morality is constructed based on trolley problems, and people are like, well, that's not really how morality is constructed. It's not all based...
Here's the interesting, let's find a real world application for this theory, okay? For the experience machine, okay? So if you're not aware, the experience machine is the idea that somebody says, if you can step into a machine, and it's not real, but if you can step into a machine and you'll live like the perfect life for the rest of your life, every possible pleasure, everything will be great, all the love, all the real shit or whatever you like in this world, you can have it in the experience machine, but it'll all be fake. But once you're in the experience machine, you won't know that. Would you do it? And the answer most people give is, well, no, because it's fake. But if you wouldn't truly know, you know, how could you say no to that? And I think the real world application to a question like that comes in with severe drug addiction. Because I think that any reasonable person would say, like, okay, obviously I'm never going to be, why the fuck would you ever be addicted to heroin? What a stupid choice to make in life. That's so dumb. Don't do that. It's obviously stupid. But once you start doing heroin and you're in that world of heroin, well, now it's like, you know, this is actually like pretty fucking awesome. You know, the real world sucks. I can enjoy this over and over again. It's just interesting conceptually to kind of like test, like, what does the human brain look for? Like, does reality matter that much? Can our emotional state influence the choices that we make? Like, I think there's a lot, there to grapple with, and to simply dismiss it and go, oh, well, you know, this is a stupid thing. This isn't realistic, especially to a guy that like was literally in the hospital addicted to benzos, right? And he had to get like fucking a huge, you know, detox program and shit. Like, I think it's a valid question to ask. Because every time Peterson was popping a benzo, he was essentially entering that experience machine. He was sacrificing the real objective world for whatever happiness existed in his mind when he was under the influence of that drug.
Based on edge cases,
It's
right?
not really how it's constructed at all. It has to be embodied, for example, and that's a crucial issue. And so the notion that a set of semantic philosophical propositions, even coherently organized, constitutes the ethical world, and that ethics is top down from the semantic space into the embodied space. There's some truth in that because there's feedback loops, right? We think about ethics, and we can move around the edges of ethics and so forth, but it's within a game that's already established. And that game is actually established through embodied negotiation first. So when you see Moses leading his people through the desert, they're all fighting and scrapping away, right? And then he sits as judge of them for a very long period of time. It's months or years even, so much that his father-in-law says, you have to stop doing this because it's exhausting you, right? It's after that he receives the revelations from on high. And so my sense of that psychologically is it's a story about the fact that morality is encoded in our behavior in a deep level. And so deep we actually don't understand the morality. But then now and then we get an imaginative insight into the moral pattern. And then we get a semantic representation of the imaginative insight, and that's this revelation. It's like, here's a moral rule. It's like wolves suddenly becoming semantically conscious of the authority relationships in their pack.
Oh, that's really good. I like that a lot. That's quite good.
Like 20 years to pick up, so put a lot of effort into that.
Yeah, no, there's a big kind of rich debate in Jewish philosophy over whether Moses is right to listen to Jethro. So Jethro comes in and says you need to devolve authority to lower levels. You need the princes, you need the judges of the tens, and then the judges of the hundreds.
Yeah, which is a lovely way of thinking about it too, because they parse out I thought that's what should have happened in Iraq, right? Kill the tyranny. Well, what do? You have to establish a hierarchical local authority.
Yeah, exactly. So Jethro,
centralized control doesn't work.
But one of the big questions is whether, in doing that, is Moses setting the stage for all of the chaos that follows. Because once you give up the authority that he has, the direct authority, and you have now layers of authority below him, how much authority can you devolve to layers below you without...
Bro, are you okay? Destiny, you're arrogant and ignorant, a dangerous combination. Where's your Swedish girlfriend? Sucking on 5 black dicks somewhere? What a fucking dumb bitch. And you are a complete clown. Ignorant, low IQ streamer. Jesus. What is she up to right now?
Go fast or anything like that, but I was like turning around. Like,
no black dicks yet. I'll keep an eye open for him. Thanks for the heads up, Chief.
Giving up the prime authority at the top, right?
That is like one of the cardinal questions of life, isn't it? If you have a family, you want to devolve authority and facilitate autonomy. And the question is, how much can you do that without generating disunity? And I would say it depends on the value of the goal that unites you. And then that brings up another question, and this is a question I would say for the moral relativists. I was talking to Rupert Sheldrake in Cambridge. He has lots of wild ideas, but I was conducting a seminar there on the nature of the uniting ideal. So it was imitation of the divine ideal. So you need a higher order aim to unite subordinate drives, right? So the question then is, what becomes the highest order ethic?
Right.
It's like the pyramid with a gold cap on the top, or the Washington Monument with a pyramid on top of it with this aluminum cap on it. Something's at the top, and the thing that's at the top is actually qualitatively distinctive from all the things that are subordinate to it. So the question is, well, what's that highest order uniting principle? And, well, one answer to that the 3 religions that are based on books have proposed is it has something to do with the authority of the word. And Christianity, that's developed into the notion of the divine word. And you see that saturating Judaism as well. And that's at least in part because the thing that has to be superordinate is freedom of, it's not freedom of thought exactly, it's more like freedom of consciousness, because logos isn't thought. It's not logic either. It's much broader than that. It's more like consciousness itself. And the reason
logos
I think
in what
that's true
sense?
technically is because imagine that consciousness and attention are in some sense isomorphic, right? I mean, when we pay attention to something, we become conscious of it.
Okay.
Consciousness is the mechanism that generates proximal solutions and dissolves and regenerates them. And so all the proximal solutions have to be made subordinate to respect for the process that generates all the...
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Okay. I think it's a cardinal presupposition of psychotherapy, because what you do in psychotherapy is you allow people maximal freedom of expression, right? You don't impose your views on them. Even the Freudians used free association. Say whatever comes into your mind, and it turns out that that process of untrammeled expression in good faith is actually curative. It actually makes people better. It leads them to what they're afraid of. That's one of the consequences of free speech, right? Because you tend to circulate around what bothers you and what disturbs you, and so untrammeled freedom of expression will lead you to the source of your fears, and then you can confront those fears, and then in confronting them you can get more courageous. That's all part of it.
Obviously.
Do you think Benny Ben is following the conversation? I feel like we're talking about a lot of random shit right now. But okay.
One of the big arguments that is used with regard to freedom of speech now is whether freedom of speech, if it threatens the structure of freedom of speech.
Yeah, right. That's one of those weird loops.
Right, exactly. It's like the Germans have an entire term for it, which they stripe our democracy.
No tolerance for intolerance.
Right, exactly. Like if it's a threat to the democracy, can you suppress the speech?
Well, I think I thought about this a lot. I think you can equate free speech with the struggling for truth, struggling towards truth. Because if you're speaking freely, you're trying to investigate rather than to convince or to claim, especially if it's during exploration. So let's say that you're guided by the desire for the truth. So you've made a commitment in faith that exploring the truth is going to be curative in the broadest sense. And then you might say, well, is that the superordinate value? And I actually don't think it is. I think the superordinate value is love. And I think I've thought about how to define love sort of practically. I would say it's the best in me serving the best in you. That's one way of thinking about it.
Okay.
But it's also the desire that all things flourish to the degree that that's possible. And so you can imagine you have a fundamental orientation on life. It could be Mephistophelian in the Faustian sense.
Of course.
Mephistopheles in Goethe's Faust. He says this twice, in the first volume and in the second volume. So Goethe was insisting on this Mephistophelian view. The suffering of being is so intolerable, it would be better if it was eradicated completely. That's the Mephistophelian view. And that's a powerful argument, you know. And I talked to Stephen Fry about God, and Fry's very interested in mythology, very oriented towards narrative, and he's a wise person. And he said, he was angry, and he said, well, I'd call him out for bone cancer in children. It's like, fair enough, you know, there's a lot of undeserved suffering in the world, and you might think, well, the whole bloody thing should be brought to a halt. My sense of that is if you pursue that path, you make everything worse. You don't make everything better. You start to become part of the process that generates the suffering you're objecting to. So you take the opposite of that viewpoint. It's like, no, we want to make everything better for everyone, including our enemies. And that's the orientation. And so I would also say that's faith. It's like I'm going to act as if I wish that everything could be as good as it could be, and then maybe even better than that.
Okay, I also feel like, to be fair to Benny Ben, I don't fault him necessarily for being lost in this conversation. Ben also, Jordan Peterson sucks at conversation too, because I think you have to slow down a little bit, or at least like try to hook into what your interlocutor is talking about, rather than just kind of going. Sometimes Peterson will just start going off, and it's like, bro, like slow down, okay? Like.
And decide that being itself is worth the effort and the repair. And then inside that, then I think truth works, because...
But there has to be mutuality there, obviously. I mean, the person that you love has to love you back, right? The sort of unrequited love you're talking about on a broad level, if it's only one way, you're going to end up giving an enormous amount of leverage to people who are not interested.
Yeah, well, that I wouldn't call... That's why you have to be wise as a serpent, you know, is that it does demand reciprocity, but I would say that if it's mature love and not naive love, and those are very different things. They're like the difference between naive trust and mature trust. Naive trust is everyone's out for the good of everyone and no one will ever hurt me. That's naive trust, and you hit someone malevolent and that just blows into pieces.
Right.
And it might bring you down, like with it, you know, because a lot of people get traumatized by malevolence. But courageous trust is, I know perfectly well you're full of snakes, just like me. but we can meet as men and women of goodwill, and we can move towards the good together. And the freedom of our discourse will facilitate that. And if we orient ourselves properly, then we'll enter into a joint enterprise that's aimed towards the good. And that works. Part of the reason our eyes are the way they are, they have whites. That's an evolved adaptation so that we can see what other people's eyes are up to.
Interesting.
And everyone who didn't have visual whites, visible
Wait, what? I've never heard this before. It might be true, but I've never heard that before.
whites either died or was killed or didn't mate. Right? And so I want to see where you're pointing your eyes, because you're devoting a tremendous amount of cortical energy to that value specification.
I've heard this before. It's a psych meme. Half the shit from Evo Psych is some crazy shit. It may be the case, but I don't know.
See what you're pointing your eyes at, and I know what you value. Then I can mimic your body with my body, and we can fall into the same, what would you say, the same
Rhythm.
game.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the same rhythm.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
And you see that in music, right? Because the musicians are heading towards a note. They all know that. They know when they're going to jump up and down in unison and hit that note.
Right.
And then they can play along the way. The music has a point, or you don't even want to listen to it. And it's so satisfying when they hit that climax all together, right? It's like, we got the point, man.
It's true in relationships too, and I think that as we atomize ourselves in our relationships, I think the relationships break down. That you have to have that rhythm, and you also have to have the ability to.
That's why you dance with your partner.
Yeah, that refusal to acknowledge the differences that you have with your partner. And there's a beautiful thing in the beginning of Genesis. So the phrase that's used when it talks about Eve and Adam is before. So it's really fascinating. I mean, the whole thing is really beautifully symbolic. That Eve never receives a name until after they're kicked out of the Garden of Eden. She's called just the woman until that point, and then he names her, right? He first names her and he says, she will be called Isha, right, which is a derivative of Ish, which is the same word, just add a hey at the end, because that's how he sees her. She's a derivative of him. She's just an object for him to use, and that's why she ends up talking to the snake. Because if you're seen as an object by somebody, why would you want to talk with them? You're not an independent human being, and it's only
That's
after.
why you don't want to dance with someone who only has sexual gratification on their mind.
Exactly, and then she sins, they're kicked out, and then he renames her Eve, right? Adam calls her Eve.
Okay, so
because
hold
she's
on.
the mother of all
the first name is
living.
given by who? Adam?
Adam. So he's naming all the animals.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And then it says that.
And that's giving them a reality, a semantic reality.
Right, and then God says none of these partners and Adam can't find a partner.
Right, they're not suitable.
And he says, so I'm going to give you a helpmate.
You need a woman, not a dog, not a pet dog.
Exactly. He says you need a helpmate, but the phrase that's used is ezer kenegdo. So it's translated helpmate.
Yeah.
What it actually means is a helper against you.
Oh.
That's what it actually means in Hebrew. Ezer kenegdo, right?
So there's an adversarial element in there.
Yeah, because what makes you a
there's
better
this
person
idea
is the
called-
adversarial element.
There's this idea in neurophysiology called opponent processing. It's really cool. So if you want to move your hand really smoothly this way, you can do it like that. But it's nowhere near as smooth as if you do this. You can be absolutely precise. So you really tense this hand against this hand, and then this one relents a little bit. It's absolute precision. And so that adversarial process, you imagine that women and men are slightly different temperamentally, or even quite a bit different. Well, you're trying to hit the mark, but the mark...
Okay. Sometimes I feel like you guys are so keen to disagree with every single thing he says, you'll question mark anything, okay? You're like a Twitch chat. Even when you guys do this, it triggers the fuck out of me. What he's saying is actually true, though. If you've ever been a kid that snuck around at night, now, maybe I figured that I have a huge brain, okay? But if you've ever been a kid that's trying to sneak around at night, you ever do the thing where you want to open a door really slowly? You know how you do it. You don't twist the handle and then open the door very slowly. You put your hand against the door, you twist the handle, and you push on the door and you pull with your hand, and you can very, 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 very slowly open the door that way. Has nobody ever done this before? Am I the only person you do this, and it lets you open the door incredibly slowly? If you're ever trying to like sneak in and out of rooms or whatever, and not get like fucked with by your parents or whatever, I do this all the time. Yeah, there is some truth to this. Right. I've never seen Shapiro fight harder for talking time than when he does with Peterson. Well, I think it's because Peterson's really bad at going back and forth in a conversation with somebody. He you can tell because a good conversation should have both people. So here's, I'm going to say this and now they're not going to do it, right? But here's something, this is the hallmark of a bad conversation. A good conversation is, I start a conversational thread, and then somebody else will pick some of it and then they'll start talking, and then I'll pick some of that, and then they'll pick some of that, and then and then we'll kind of like go down this thread that we've started, and we kind of talk back and forth. But when Peterson talks, he'll ramble, and then when the other person talks, it's not directly engagement, and it's kind of like a new thread, and they're like, they're not really like going back and forth with these concepts. It's both them like talking a lot at each other and then kind of moving from thing to thing, because they're not like engaged with each other very well. I blame Peterson for this more than Shapiro, though, because Peterson rambles so hard, and he's a very hard time bringing it back to the conversation and weaving it back into the topic so that the other person can understand like how it's relating to what's being spoken about, which is very irritating. If I was Shapiro, I'd be very irritated. It seems like to be a pattern with lecturers. They always talk like this. Like Richard Wolff, maybe.
Moves. And so how do you hit it? Well, you hit it with this adversarial process. And you do that with kids. And when you're negotiating in the house, too, it's like, well, you think this and I think this.
And that's why when you fundamentally refuse to acknowledge the difference between the sexes, you lose the azer conegdo part of that. You lose that opposition that's necessary.
That's also, see, my wife has a more masculine temperament than me, and she's really low in politeness, which is an aspect of agreeableness. And it makes her quite formidable as a combatant. And sometimes in our life, she'll say things that are so outrageous that, well, it usually makes me laugh. Like in an intense fight, she'll say like 3 of the worst insults you could possibly imagine, and it'll make me laugh. And it's hard sometimes to deal with her because of this more aggressive element. But it was also something that really attracted me towards her, because she's no pushover, and she's got a kind of a knife-like sense of humor that comes out quite often. And so I really like the combative element to it. And that's part of what keeps a relationship dynamically alive. So that's very cool. So that's the first name?
So he first calls her Isha and says, because God's going to give her his azer conegdo. And then after the whole element with he calls her Isha and
dynamically alive. So that's very cool. So that's the first name?
So he first calls her Isha and says, because God's going to give her his azer conegdo. And then after the whole element with
and he called, okay, so God says he's gonna deliver this. What's the word?
Azer conegdo, right? So it's a helpmate.
Right, but it's an adversarial partner.
Yeah, the word conegdo literally means against him, right?
Wow,
it's going to be Azer, helper, against him, right?
Okay, and then Adam
calls her Isha, right? Because she's flesh of my flesh, she's bone of my bone, which is how a man sees a woman when the woman is just an object to him, right? Because she's mine, right? It's my possessiveness of her that defines her as a human being, and the word woman, just like in English, is a derivative of the word man, right? It's Ish, which is spelled Aleph Yud Shin. It's the same spelling, you just add a hey at the end, and now it's Isha. Right? So she's going to be called woman because I'm called man. So
somebody just brought this up too. I wasn't going to say this either. I'm not trying to shit on any of these guys, just giving you guides to conversations. Something else that I noticed that Peterson does a little bit too. I'm guilty of this sometimes in conversation. I try to stop myself because I definitely do this as well. Sometimes people are listening to a conversation, not to actually listen and engage, but because they're looking to respond and they want to slip something in. You were literally shitting on them. I'm not shitting on them. If you think this is me shitting on people, you have no fucking idea what it means to shit on somebody, or you're very soft and you haven't seen me actually shit on them. I'm not shitting on you. I'm just critiquing their conversing abilities. More, and I've said over and over again, more Peterson than Shapiro. But yeah, like it feels sometimes like Peterson is looking. He's like very eager to get like a word in or a concept in or something, instead of like trying to engage well with what Ben is saying sometimes. Yeah.
She's
a secondary
derivative of me.
Right, which is how a man would understand a woman. It's like she's like me except smaller.
Right, exactly.
Right.
And then once she starts to bear children, then he calls her Chava, right, Eve, the mother, which is the same root of life and Chava, right? Chai is the same root. So it's
is that etymologically related to the word for chaos? Do you know? In Hebrew?
In Hebrew?
Yeah.
Like at the
formless chaos at the beginning of time. Is there a relationship between that and Eve's name?
I don't think so. I'd have to check it. But he says she's the mother of all living, and then that's how she's defined. What gives her a meaning is the thing that actually does give women meaning, and that we as a society have decided is the ability to bear children, which is of course what we as a society have decided to deride and pretend is not a superpower and treat as a secondary aspect of femininity, when it is in fact the primary aspect of femininity. And so it's really it's quite fascinating, and it's really...
That's why I like Beauty and the Beast. Because I taught a lot about hero mythology to my students, and the women would sometimes come up and say, well, what about the female heroes? And I thought, well, that's complicated, because you have the image of Mary, and that's pretty maternal, but in Christianity, Christ is also the redeemer of women, and that's an adventurous hero in some sense. It's like, so the female situation is complicated, right? Because there is this adventurous spirit, but it has to be combined with this maternal fecundity, let's say, and involuntarily. Well, what I really liked about Beauty and the Beast, and I do think that's the best Disney movie ever made, was that it's a real female hero myth. I mean, the woman, Beauty, is beautiful, so she's high up in the female dominance hierarchy, but she's witty and well-read and intelligent and adventurous and brave and courageous and truthful, all of that. And she doesn't fall for Gaston, the psychopathic persona. And young women are much more likely to fall for men like that, by the way, than women who are slightly more, what would you say?
Mature.
Wiser. So they'll fall for dark triad men, and that's partly how psychopathy propagates itself across the generations.
Don't tell Anna.
Right? They can be enticed by psychopathic personas. But she prefers the Beast. It's like, well, the Beast is the adventure. It's like, well, is this terrible man, you know, like he's rough, he's unhued, but he's got potential, right? And that's what really attracts her. And she wants someone who can guard the walls and make a safe haven for the children, but who's generous enough who's productive.
Wait, what? I had a way different reading of that movie than this interpretation. Now, if we're interpreting media, we could interpret it in the way that we want to tell a story that we want to, but in terms of like having this being a grounded interpretation, I thought that the Beauty and the Beast had, I could be wrong. It's been a long time since I've seen this movie, like decades probably. But I thought the point of the Beauty and the Beast was way simpler in that it was basically just like a don't judge a book by its cover. Like, I don't think she wanted the Beast because he was this hugely powerful person that could guard the walls. I thought it was because he was a genuinely good person. He just has like a frightening exterior. That's
productive enough to be useful and generous enough to share.
But technically we can read into these however we want if we're trying to make a point, I guess.
Well, that's the female hero myth. It's like the civilizing of men is the female hero myth, and the civilizing of nature, in some sense, is the male hero myth.
And to pretend that that's like a secondary pursuit, which is what the society says, that like what we should value is, in a certain way, feminism is a construct of the patriarchy because
they're completely, and it's modern, guys, because the notion is, well, the men have got it all right, and all we'd have to do is for women to be more like men.
Right. Exactly.
That's your aim. My wife is engaged in a series of discussions with this Jonathan Pajot I mentioned earlier. It's an inquiry into the symbolism of the divine feminine, because we have a real question in our culture. We have a more elaborated narrative of, let's say, call it masculine heroism. And a more differentiated sense of masculine totalitarianism as well. The female role is still somewhat undifferentiated, and I think that's partly not acceptable anymore because women have control of the reproductive function now. So a lot of this has to become conscious. It can't just happen automatically.
Right. No, I mean, that's right. And so at a time when the virtues of...
One of the big problems that I have with how conservatives traditionally read onto gender roles is people will say like, well, women just have a different role than men. They're not better, they're not worse, they just have a different role. And in an abstract sense, I can get that kind of like, okay, well, women excel at taking care of children, doing the whole blah, 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 blah. But it does seem to be the case that there is an intrinsic drive for a lot of types of roles, and all of these are relegated to the masculine, which I think feels pretty shit. So for instance, like, I think it's probably pretty common through human history that a woman might think, wow, it would be really cool if I could like fight and save a nation or do these cool athletic things or be a hero that goes on adventures, blah, blah, blah. That's probably like a pretty big staple of human history. I don't think that's that controversial to say that. But I don't know if it's ever been the case. So that's like an example of like the feminine desiring the masculine, right? But I don't know historically if it's ever been the other way around. If there's a lot of men that are like, God, it would be so cool to like just stay home and take care of my kids and to be really feminine and pretty and not be able to do any of these things. Like, I don't think the envy goes the other way. And I think that demands a bit of attention, right? If all of the cool traits are relegated to the masculine, and then we call that masculinity, and then all of the kind of like their complementary traits, I could say, get relegated to the feminine, and we call that femininity, and then we say that anytime like we've set up a dichotomy where anytime a woman is trying to escape this, it's like necessarily a bad thing, or we said this is what it means to be a man, and this is like the only thing, this is like relegated to the domain of man. I don't know. I feel like that's a kind of a shitty thing to do. I mean, creating life, you don't think anyone ever thought of that? No. Come on, dude, really? You think men are like, God, I wish I could get pregnant and have a kid? Because men can create life just as well as women can, but we aren't burdened with the physical arduousness of it, right? A man creating life is busting a nut in a woman's pussy. A woman creating life is dilating her cervix, fucking 20 times larger than it normally is, and then spending 8 hours screaming in a hospital, drugged up like a motherfucker because of the pain so that she can have a kid, right? We're not the same, okay, when we create life. So no, I don't think that generally men are like, God, I wish I could do that, you know? And we're not even talking about the annoyance of being pregnant for 9 months, you know?
Femininity need to be taught more than ever. They're being taught the opposite more than ever. Because you have to opt into this feature of humanity.
See, Ben is like trying to get a thing out, and Peterson's already got another speech ready to go, and Ben is like trying to just finish out his thought.
Where before you didn't have to opt into it, it was going to be forced upon you, right? I mean, as long as you were going to engage in sexual activity, you were going to experience the joys of motherhood, and you were going to have to play this role. But now you no longer have to, which means that you actually have to be taught that there's value in the role.
He's letting him speak now. Okay.
Embrace the role,
and you have to be willing to notice that without seeing that as only part of you in your peculiarity and not as something regressive. Somebody clipped something I said and put it on one of those YouTube shorts. It's like 3 minutes long. And
that's a very modern and male-focused point of view. Consider the many matriarchies in history. There's not many. My history is shit, but even I can tell you there's not many. That is a very small minority of women-led societies versus male-led societies. You can point to me like one or two, but it's like when socialists, like, what about the Rojava or whatever? What about like the one Portugal for 10 years, or not Portugal, Yugoslavia or whatever? Like, yeah. How do you misspeak that word? What was it? Patriarchy? Matriarchies? I've never seen this word in my life, so I don't know. But
I don't know, 8 million views or something, and they called it advice to 19.
Oh, matriarchy. Oh, he spelled it wrong. I'm just reading what he said. Consider the many matriarchies in history. I don't know if that was like a word for like a type of female. Matriarchy would be a word I'm familiar with. He is trolling. You go read his thing. He literally said it.
18-year-old women. And so what I said in this brief video was that, okay, so we'll go for another minute, was that I've worked with women as peers my whole life. So I was part of the first generation, I would say, and certainly in my profession in psychology, there's been a plethora of women, certainly since before I entered the field. So I've worked with women as peers my entire life. And I worked, even before that, I worked in the daycare branch of Alberta Social Services and as a consultant, and that was mostly women too. So, and what I noticed about women, and this really was struck home to me when I worked with high-end lawyers in Toronto, because I worked with the best law firms in Toronto for 10 years with their best lawyers. They would send them to me, and some other people that were involved in this enterprise, and our deal was, we'll increase the efficiency of your high-end lawyers by 10% in terms of billable hours, but we work for them, not you. And so then I had about 15 of lawyers like this come and see me. They were skeptical to begin with, but we got over that pretty quick. And some of it was management discussion, some of it was strategy, some of it was sorting out their marriage, work-life balance. Like, it really depended on the individual, as it should in the therapeutic session. But we had a lot of discussions with the women because the law firms lost all their women in their early 30s. And the story was always the same. So these women who became these top lawyers, they all had the same story. They're hyper-conscientious and very, very smart. So they were top of junior high, top of high school, top of their class in college, went to a great law school, top law school class, they went to a great law firm, and then they walked through the legal ranks till they hit senior partner. No, like blinders on, like conscientious people will have. I'm going to attain up this pyramid. Then they'd hit 30 or so when they hit senior partner, equivalent of tenured professor. And then they woke up and thought, what the hell am I doing here? I'm working like 80 hours a week, 75 hours a week, flat out. Because you don't get to that level unless you're performing. And you get a call at 2 a.m. from some client in China who's got a corporate merger. It's like, you're awake and on it. And you put that on top of everything, or you don't get paid $750 an hour. And you say, well, that's the patriarchy. It's like, no, it's not. It's the market.
Thoughts on the conversation as a whole? It's interesting, but dude, society has changed. Like, No, society hasn't changed. We've always been this. I wish that these conversations would happen between smart people in adversarial senses. There needs to be more intelligent left-leaning people that can have like intelligent conversations about these topics that can provide a challenge. It's so much more interesting than listening to two people kind of like circle jerk on the topic. Not that circle jerks are always bad. Like you can have like an entertaining circle jerk, but it would be more interesting listening to more. I say adversarial. I don't mean like combative, but just somebody like, oh, like this person clearly disagrees with this person about this. I think it'd be more interesting.